So today we're talking about injury proofing yourself. Again, this is the third pillar inside that whole framework that I gave you in the very beginning of 2 weeks ago. All right. So what we have to remember is if you're hiding behind the concept of I have to be in good form to not be injury proof, or I have to warm up, which there's some truth to that, to be injury proof, or so I don't get injury proof, or I just have to be really, really focused and really go through the workouts and be really, really diligent. Those things work, but they only work to a certain degree because soft tissue might not be aligned and activation not being aligned. And that's what I want to walk you through today is the activation portion of it. Then we're going to take apart the hip a little bit further because a lot of people don't realize that hip low back structure is so important to so many different things, mentally, emotionally, physically, mentally, and emotionally, that it's bananas. So there is a big push around low back, and low back is a huge industry, low back pain, things like that, a lot of people are now starting to see the importance of your hips, and the hip flexor is taking a big hit. So before I go into this, I have to give you a disclaimer in the aspect of working with your hip flexors. There's a reason why they're really, really tight. And on the emotional side, it now creates this fight or flight pattern that now holds us into protecting our organs. So if there is emotional distress or your environment is not safe per se, in the aspect of you can't be yourself, you can't be open, you can't do the things that you want to do, those things are naturally going to have a higher tension rate, bringing you in further. So it might not want to open for that reason, not because of all the other things I'm about to show you. But unless you understand all sides of the subject, you'll never really truly understand how to be injury proof. That's the first part of this. Hip flexor fact number 2 is hip flexors attach low on the hip itself, goes up and attaches right underneath your diaphragm. Even some fibers intersect with the diaphragm. So every time you take a breath, you're actually giving electrical current to that. So I want you to remember that every time you take a breath, electrical current is going and infiltrating into your system of your hip flexor. Now, why is that important? Because in the activation world, we have the two other factors, knowing your internal world, knowing where you're at cellularly, hydration, as well as your belief system in what you're doing, let's say, how well you can heal, your soft tissue work, can everything move? Those things aside, you have to remember their body follows laws and principles. One of them being if something in the front of the body turns on. So if I make a bicep curl, right? In order for this movement to happen, the tricep has to electrically turn off. So you have to remember every time the electrical system of your body turns a light switch off, which is a muscle fiber, brings more energy to it, it's going to turn off the opposite muscle. So every time you breathe, you naturally bring more energy to the hip flexor. Point blank. Every time you breathe, that happens. Paired with the environment that you live in, gives you a recipe for why your hip flexors want to be so tight. Now, we're not going to talk about what's the polar side of the hip flexor because there's different muscle tissues that turn on and turn off based off of that. But we want to now get you to realize that is happening. That's a real thing that consistently is being not spoken about or misunderstood. Depending on the environment, your internal structure is going to want to be protective, which is going to hold a natural tension rate. Now, that's the important part, the tension rate that's here. So when I was talking about the fascial system, I said sometimes your fascial system is dried out and it's like leather, and you're trying to stretch leather. It doesn't really work. This is not leather, but it doesn't really want to work. Or this is like the muscle bodybuilder trying to stretch. They're worked out their muscle tissue so much that their contractile system is locked in. Everything doesn't want to go, so now they're fighting. And then we have the yoga world. Not saying one is better than the other. Is they're stretching out, and they're stretching out so far because they have the length, but because they don't have the strength, they are now able to blow something out. So stretching alone never works. You want a dynamic of both. Understanding what's happening inside your hip flexors on the environmental world as well as the internal world, that's when you become injury proof. Now, how do you solve that problem? Is you want to think like a slingshot. Slingshot, you want to be able to hold something at the base, really, really tight at the base. So now something can stretch and it can give you the feedback of how far it is stretching and how far it's working based off that strong base. Every muscle system, every muscle unit itself needs to have that. So with your hip flexors, what I want to show you is how do you activate your hip flexors so your hip flexors naturally want to open, right? That's the thing that I want to show you. So what I want you to do is shove your butt against the wall. I have a pole here, nice and easy. And what you want to do is find that place where you're starting to get the slight stretch underneath your hamstring into your calf. I want you to bring your belly button in and then pull your pelvic floor up, right? So when people tell me I have to have great form and they don't have great form, it's because they don't have muscle tissues active. The biggest ideal here is, let me actually show you that before I show you this, is the hip flexor stretch that everyone's doing now. They're putting the wall stretch or the quad stretch or the couch stretch. They're bringing their leg up, but they're not realizing that their glute is off. You see how mine is off, on, off, on? When they're doing their stretch, their glute can't turn on and doesn't stay on, which means this is now sucking up all the energy, turning off your glute. So we want to be able to have this area turn on with this being able to stretch, which means it's balanced, stable, open, right? The reason why we're doing this is because we're pulling in here, pulling up our pelvic floor, belly button in, creating that stable, and then picking up your leg and crossing over the dumbbell, right? So I have this. This is my max. People use, I show people a shoe. I show people many different things, but you want to just cross over the dumbbell. And it's not a jerk and you see it moving. It's belly button in, pelvic floor up, up and over. And as that muscle tissue starts to activate more and more, it's going to start becoming more and more able to stretch based off the strength that it has. I did just a few, and now when I do this stretch, it opens up so much faster, so much better, and this glute is now stable. It's on. That's what you want to start looking for. Activation is finding the muscle tissues that's no longer active because you've been going through the same behavior pattern, the same movement patterns to do the squats, to do the lunges, that's not incorporating the whole muscle fiber. The very good example that I use all the time is your upper fibers of your glute above the piriformis. So you have your hips, you have the piriformis that swings your foot out, that crosses right across the top part of the glute. Everything above hand gets turned off because that piriformis is taking all the energy, and the anterior side of the hip flexor taking all that juice. That no longer needs to work. And that's why your QLs are always so, your quadratus lumborum, right around your back is always so tight, because that muscle tissue is no longer working. I go into a rant there, but what you want to really focus on is now we have our soft tissue work dialed in, getting all those things worked, fascial system working, stretching, contractile stretching, then into activation and getting all these muscle tissues to activate. That's when you're going to find your sweet spot. That's when you really start to take off, because now you're creating a stable with everything that you do as you elongate. So if you have any questions about this, this is where it starts to get a little nuancy, and you have to start understanding a little bit of neurology and a little bit of anatomy to understand this muscle works, this muscle has to turn off to make this action happen, and then just focusing that through looking at the way you move, how you move. That will show you everything. And then the next part, which we're going to talk about next week, is awareness. How do you know these muscles are even off? Like, what to look at when I'm doing my squat. Like, I see so many people go into the squats and they're bending over and they're squatting because they can't open up here. Or they come into their deep squat and they're tucking under because their adductors are way too tight. All these things are pulling you in many different ways, and you don't realize that it's not smooth. It's not easy. You can't sit in this deep squat here and have your heels touch the ground and be able to stand up without an object behind you, right? That means my ankles need to be in place. My hips, my adductors need to be in place. All those things play a massive role in optimizing performance, injury prevention. But we're looking at, can I do the action rather than how I'm doing the action? Once you look at how you're doing the action, it's what muscle tissues are active or not active. We bring it all the way back down to that just by watching you and becoming aware, and that's what next week's about. Then you start realizing how really simple it is to do the small things at a very small amount of time that now will make your training skyrocket. Hopefully this helped. Please hit me up if you have any questions whatsoever. I'm an open book, and there's a lot of questions that should follow after this, so I'm excited to hear what you got to say. Later.